Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Happy Tuesday to you all on this windy afternoon here in New Jersey. We should have a great show, but I have a little bit of news before we get into anything else. As of tomorrow, I am moving over to a new show, so this is officially the last episode with me as your host of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We're moving over to the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and I'll be talking more about all different kinds of sports, whether it be football, college football, hockey, basketball, which is something we're going to get into in this episode. Even soccer, if there are fans across the pond over there as well. So this is the final episode of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hopefully there will be a new host for you in the future, but I am moving on to pastures new as the host of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast as of tomorrow. So I hope all of you come along for the ride with me. It should be a fun one. But other than that, let us talk about today's show. We'll be talking about fantasy basketball for our last ever show, something we haven't really done here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, a sport I'm not as familiar with as I was with fantasy football, but it's still a very interesting fantasy sport, something we'll be talking about a lot more on Dead Ball. But ultimately, it's going to be a great show to close out GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast era of my time here with the network. We're talking all things waiver wire for fantasy basketball, talking about the top point guards all the way on down to the power forwards for this episode. But other than that, before we get into any of that, you know the drill so far as liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network. If you want more content such as this, it is greatly appreciated by all concerned. But if you want to contribute and interact with the shows a little bit more directly and check out everything around the network and interact with other hosts as well, because they're making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can do it through our website as well. It is greatly appreciated by all as well. It just makes our shows that much better. Go check them out, especially as I enter my new era and new chapter here at the network with the Dead Ball Sports Podcast. Without further ado, let us jump right into the last episode of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast for now, talking about the fantasy basketball world. Talking about some waiver wire pickups. Ultimately, these are the guys in fantasy basketball you might want to be looking at for in terms of growth, in terms of maturity throughout the season, whether they be on rebuilding rosters or teams trying to compete for that play-in tournament, because as you all know, waiver wire can mean a lot of things. It can mean that you find a hidden gem on a contending team, or these are players who are playing meaningful minutes but not necessarily meaningful basketball, if that makes sense. So without further ado, let us jump right into discussions of who you might want to find out on the waiver wire this week, starting off with a San Antonio Spur, who really complements this team very well as they're fighting for their play-in lives, currently sitting at 10th in the Western Conference. How about Mr. Jeremy Sochan? This is a guy who I really liked coming out of college, coming out of Baylor a couple of years ago. Really at the definition of what the Spurs want to do. Solid rebounding, both offensively and defensively, and a lot of defensive versatility. There are some defensive limitations with this basketball team. Obviously, it comes with bringing in Chris Paul to kind of be the leader of this group. But ultimately, it complements the team very well. And hopefully we see them continue this run throughout the season, hopefully securing a play-in spot, maybe climbing up the ranks of the play-in tournament. Excuse me. But Jeremy Sochan is going to be an exciting player to watch. Very solid. If you were looking for someone maybe at the front court positions who provides a little bit of versatility, maybe as a flex option, maybe as a deep bench player or role player for your fantasy basketball team, Jeremy Sochan just might be the guy for you. And this is going to be the theme of this waiver wire segment here. A lot of big guys, not necessarily too many shooting guards, point guards out there who can truly contribute at a level of consistency for you, I would say. But these guys who are younger, front court players are looking like they could potentially be nice little ads to monitor throughout the fantasy basketball season. Speaking of young guys, much like Jeremy Sohan making a name for themselves on quote-unquote rebuilding / play-in teams, let's talk about Alex Sarr, the second overall pick in this year's draft, one of 3 French players taken in the top 10, the first time in history that France has put 3 players into the top 10 of the NBA draft. But Alex Sarr certainly was the most unique of the 3, I would say. He's a fantastic shot blocker, provides a lot of rim protection for this rebuilding Washington Wizards squad, certainly adds a lot of depth as well as they're trying to rebuild for the future of this franchise. It's going to be a struggle all season long, but that might potentially be what people are looking for. Guys on these bad teams who overperform expectations, exceed expectations, and Alex Sarr is doing just that. And I feel like with these 2 guys, it's truly setting the foundation that this is a big man's game. And no matter how many years you have been in the league, there's more chance of success for you at these front court positions than these next 2 guys who I'm talking about, because it's very difficult to break through, in my opinion, as a point guard or shooting guard, as a facilitator of your team, when it truly has become a very big man dominant game. There are some teams who kind of break away from that norm, but until then, I'm truly seeing a shift in the league from teams that win games by facilitating the basketball through ball movement to big men really being successful in the pick and roll game and really being successful in terms of their defensive prowess. So both of these guys, Sohan and Sarr, fall into that latter camp and are really for these teams that, whether it be the Spurs and you're kind of farther along in the rebuild than you initially thought, or the Wizards, who certainly are looking to be one of the worst teams in basketball this season, but hopefully want to find something to build on in the future. These 2 guys could be franchise cornerstones that really help any franchise superstars like Victor Wembanyama, and like if the Wizards find someone in the draft this year as they get a high pick in the lottery. Ultimately, these 2 guys, I feel like, are the safest bets out of this bunch I'm going to be talking about. Nothing against these next 2 guys, but ultimately, I really like the big man in fantasy basketball. But the next 2 guys, the third guy being DeAndre Hunter of the Hawks. Someone had to step up once Dejounte Murray went out the door, and DeAndre Hunter has been an incredible player for this Hawks team, really stepping into his role. A Hawks team I really like, sitting in the middle of the pack in the Eastern Conference. And I really think that it's going to come down to the way this Hawks team is structured. It's very, in my opinion, guard-oriented. Trae Young really being the point general for this team, and all the players around him providing the floor spacing on offense. But defensively, the Hawks are going to have to find ways to slow down teams in transition, because they're 24th in turnovers. So they're really going to have to find ways to slow down teams in transition and keep up with the paciness of some of these East Conference offenses. But DeAndre Hunter has been a brilliant 2-way winger, and he really has, like I said, stepped up his production in the absence of Dejounte Murray. There's still some stars out there for the Hawks that would like to see step up. Bogdan Bogdanovic providing that floor space and providing that 3-point shot. Some other guys down low. I'm not necessarily too familiar with the Hawks here, but ultimately guys like Larry Nance Jr., if he doesn't move on in the trade deadline. Onyeka Okongwu, still young, still fresh, still a vital piece of this team and what they're trying to do. Potentially Clint Capella still can put in a shift at 30 years of age, but still DeAndre Hunter could be the glue that brings this team together come postseason time as they try to compete in this very top-heavy Eastern Conference. So kudos to DeAndre Hunter for really stepping into the role that Dejounte Murray once filled. Hopefully, even a rookie like Zachary Richardson can step in and step up once they come to the postseason, but that might be asking a little bit too much of him. But ultimately, for the Hawks, DeAndre Hunter might be the number 2 option going forward for the rest of the season for them. And then last but not least, a guy who's I feel like has kind of declined in terms of where this offense was and his role in it fell last season. Andrew Nembhard. He really is a kind of Jekyll and Hyde player because when he's on, he's one of the best facilitators of the basketball in the National Football League. He keeps the steady pace of this Pacers offense, much like what we saw last year. When he's not, I feel like this Pacers offense craters a little bit. It grows a little bit stagnant because they are reliant on both him and Tyrese Halliburton to maintain the fast pace of this offense. He did flirt with a triple-double over the holiday season against the Celtics, but ultimately he hasn't really had a nice string of games where you can rely on him in, say, a starting role. I see him as more of a bench piece, especially at the quote-unquote guard position, because guards are so tough to navigate in the fantasy basketball landscape, and if you get them wrong, chances are it might not be too important, but they're still vital and integral to get right because of the depth you might want in your front court as well, because you won't want the back end to really screw you over. So Andrew Nembhard's one of those kinds of players where you have to monitor the Pacers season, whether or not they can get back to what we saw last year, where their best basketball was these guys pushing the pace, both Nembhard and Halliburton, who we'll talk about next segment. But ultimately, until then, I feel like Andrew Nembhard's just a wild card of a player in the waiver wire landscape because of the fact, he is a guard and he does play for an offense that requires a lot from you. So it's going to come down to whether or not you like the fast pace of the Pacers offense, whether or not you want a guard who might not be as consistent as you would like, but can still put up numbers for you. That's the question. So that's why I feel like both Hunter and Nembhard players might want to monitor more closely, but Sohan and Sarr could be like very nice pickups for you come, say, the latter stages of the NBA season. But until then, let me know what you think in the comments about this, because we're going to be talking a little bit more about basketball as we transition shows. But coming up next, we'll be talking about the point guard position and who has been leading the pack thus far, a little under the midway point of the season to date in that regard. So we'll be right back after that short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day, talking about the top point guards in fantasy basketball thus far this season, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the shows and the network if you haven't done so already. Keep up to date with me as I transition to the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and also continue contributing and interacting with the shows a little bit more directly through the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Also at our website, GSMCpodcast.net. You can leave a tip or donation or questions, comments, or concerns at both. It is greatly appreciated and makes our shows that much better here at the GSMC Sports Network. Without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of the day, talking about the top point guards in fantasy basketball thus far, a little under the midway point of this season, getting ready for the All-Star game, which should be exciting. But let's talk about the point guard position, how it has changed and shifted in terms of the narrative surrounding it from a fantasy basketball perspective. In my mind, I remember when I was in high school, when I was playing fantasy basketball a little bit more often, and I saw a shift in the players I played with's mindset surrounding point guards. They were still heavily concerned about the position, but not necessarily to the point where they were really going all in as players who really were concerned about getting the position right. They felt that they could balance the position a little bit more, and they really saw the big man revolution. And I was one of the proponents of this big man revolution in my league, really hammering home guys like Jokic, guys like Davis, really stepping up their game and becoming the faces of fantasy basketball. But without further ado, though, let's talk about the point guard position, because it is still a vital position if you can get it right. And remember, the versatility of fantasy basketball allows you to kind of stretch things a little bit. You can put shooting guards and players who could be seen as small forwards at the point guard position. One guy who we're going to be talking about is Luka Doncic. He is indefinable in terms of what position he plays. So without further ado, let us jump right into this very versatile position of fantasy basketball. Starting off with Luka, who unfortunately right now is out with that calf strain. Could be another month until he gets it back, which is really unfortunate because now we know that Kyrie Irving's going to be out for at least 1 to 2 weeks. So we're really going to have to see the Mavs kind of do like what they did last year, rely on guys like their sixth man, Derek Lively, those guys to really step up in their absence and stay afloat in that play-in race. But Luka Doncic, when he was healthy, was one of the best point guards, if you view him that way, at least in the NBA. 28.1 points, 8.3 assists, 7.8 rebounds was his stat line, 56.2 fantasy points per game average. So as you can see, when he's healthy, truly one of the best point guards in the league. If you so choose to put him there, they play him there very often. He really is the facilitator of this offense. And once he gets going, some of the pick and roll game they play in that offense is beautiful to watch. I saw it in the finals against my Celtics. So we really know how special Luka Doncic is, but unfortunately he has to sit out for another month, kind of recuperating that calf strain, and unfortunately we can't necessarily use him in return for our fantasy basketball teams. But when he comes back, you better believe that a lot of people, if he's still out there on the waiver wire because someone dropped him due to injury, might be clamoring to pick him up. Now let's talk about a younger guy who is a true point guard in my regards, at least. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. This guy has been one of the best Thunder players of the past 2 years. Truly a fantastic facilitator of the basketball as well. 31.3 points, 6 assists, 5.5 rebounds, 53.4 fantasy points per game. I feel like this young man is going to be the face of this franchise for years to come. Yes, they have a lot of young players. Guys like Lou Dort, guys like Chet Holmgren, guys like Jalen Williams, all electrifying in their own right, all providing what this Thunder team really does best, playing solid offensively and playing very solid defensively as well with guys like Holmgren and Dort. But most importantly, on the offensive side of the basketball, it is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's poise and composure facilitating this offense that really stands out to a lot of fantasy basketball owners. And I feel like his star is going to continue to shine as the Thunder become a true championship contender, which they already are. But I really think that if we want to start calling them a dynasty after this year, should they get to the championship and win, SGA is going to have to be the face of this team, and he's handled it so far very well. And I feel like Thunder could transition into a team that's more offensive-minded, that can really alleviate the burden on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, but he's already doing a fantastic job, truly being the creator in this offense, the baser in this offense, and so on and so forth. Already have a lot of competitive wins against very good teams, much like the Celtics won last night. I believe they're playing the Thunder tomorrow. The Cavaliers tomorrow night. They are the Thunder, but ultimately it should be an exciting affair with an exciting point guard leading the way for OKC for years to come. Now let's talk about a guy who's kind of headed in the opposite direction after a breakout season last year, Tyrese Haliburton. And I feel like the reason why he's been so frustrating is because the Pacers haven't used him as often. They really ran him into the ground in last year's playoffs where he was seeing a high volume of minutes. And ultimately, I think that Rick Carlisle wants to slow down his usage rate a little bit to the point where it's only a 20.6% usage rate for him. Thus, you see a decline in stats, only 17.6 points per game and 8.6 assists per game. So as you can see, a steady decline in a guy in Tyrese Halliburton who held a lot of promise after last season. And he still holds a lot of promise. The Pacers are firmly in the playoff picture. But I do feel like in order to get back to what they do best, you have to kind of be much like what Tom Thibodeau is with the Knicks. You kind of have to play your best players because, granted, the Pacers are a semi-deep team. They have enough experience to the point where they could be very competitive on any given night. But I just feel like you need that presence of Tyrese Halliburton. You need that pace. And yes, it runs the risk of injuries. It runs the risk of, showing your best hand too early, but ultimately Tyrese Halliburton is the key cog in this Pacers machine, and ultimately I feel like if his usage rate ups just a little bit, I feel like the Pacers could climb the standings over these next couple of months and become the team we knew them to be in last year's playoffs. And still, when you look at the depth of the Eastern Conference, I feel like you have teams that understand what it means to A, play as a team, but B, also trust their superstars. Cleveland and Boston have done that in spades, playing fantastic team basketball, but a team like New York that really relies on a lot of minutes for a lot of their stars could be the blueprint for the Pacers. And yes, it's a risky plan, like I said, but I do feel that Tyrese Halliburton is a worthy player of that superstardom and that level of play that he so deserves and showed that he can be able to implement in his game going forward. So that's why I feel like Tyrese Halliburton is still someone you should invest in. And I still feel like he is someone who is going to have a bright second half of the season. I mean, not to the point where, like last year, he truly was the superstar point guard we were all talking about very highly of, but still someone who you can rely upon in your fantasy basketball circle. And then last, but definitely not least, let's talk about the conundrum that is Stephen Curry. Because he still is a fantastic player. And the Warriors are still a team that you never want to say die with, because they still have that mentality of we can get into the postseason, and if we do, anything can happen. But Steph has been someone who, as the years have gone on, has had to rely a little bit more on the depth of his team than a lot of other point guards, because his game slowly has become a little less important to the overall outlook of the Golden State Warriors, if that makes sense in my opinion. He still is one of the best three-point shooters in the game and still one of the best three-point shooters of all time. But I do feel like there comes a time and place where it gets in the way of what the Warriors could be building here. Because I feel like they've tried a little bit too much experimentation over the years, trying to get back to the championship formula, and it hasn't necessarily helped foment change within a player like Steph Curry, because he still is someone who is so reliant on that three-point shot, and thus it's kind of a detriment to how I see the Warriors season playing out. He still averages 22.5, 6.5, and 4.8. But ultimately, only 41.7 points per game, which is not as lofty as guys like the Lukas and SGAs of the world can put up. So you can say it's kind of a product of his environment, in that he's not playing in these teams that are as experienced as, say, Dallas, or a team that is as youthful and revolutionary as OKC, or a team that sets its pace like Indiana. But he still is Steph Curry, and you do expect him to play at a high level. It's just that this year, this Warriors team, to me, yes, lost Klay Thompson, but ultimately has lost its luster more so than any one player that could be helping them right now. And so that's why I ultimately see Steph Curry as a valuable asset in fantasy, but not more than, say, a big role player, because Luka and SGA are revolutionizing the position now. And Steph Curry feels like he's being a little bit left in the past. And this is no indictment of what he's done throughout his career, but I feel like that's the situation the Warriors and Stephen Curry are facing right now. But overall, a very interesting way to analyze and diagnose certain aspects of the point guard position is by looking at this top four, just because of the versatility of what a player like Luka brings to the table, combined with a guy in Steph Curry who is slowly going to have to shift his mindset if he wants to continue in this league to the point where he himself can progress with the times. And that's where I kind of feel like this shift in the narrative of the point guard position from a fantasy perspective could come into play, because you now have to view it in a much drastically different light than you did in recent years. But let me know what you think about the position in the comments below. But coming next, we talk about the shooting guard position. Definitely a position that's more of like a depth position, not necessarily the most fun position to talk about, but still one that adds a lot of value. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about it.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, let's talk with the shooting guard position, a position that clearly has lost a lot of luster over the years, but still adds a lot of value to your fantasy basketball team. Because the shooting guards, yes, they're not the big point getters, but they are ultimately the facilitators of the real life teams, and ultimately can add a lot of consistency and balance to your fantasy basketball team. So without further ado, let's talk about them. Now, a lot of these guys lay in the Eastern Conference, and a lot of them really are developing their games more in a team-centric manner, while others really are having to carry their teams as well. Some of the Western Conference guys, particularly, because that's the point of a shooting guard. The shooting guard can either be a guy who can be your main scorer any given night, or really molds into what the team represents. And two of these guys, at the very least, I know, are representative of that kind of mindset. But some other two guys are more of the scoring type, so that you may be more inclined to look at them rather than these other two guys I'm going to talk about. So let's talk about them, though, in their own right. Starting off with a guy in number 4 in Donovan Mitchell, who I really like as one of the more balanced shooting guards in the NBA. 23.1, 4.6, 4.6 averages, 40.8 fantasy points per game. So as you can see, this shooting guard position is a position where you see these higher splits between these players, but not necessarily as high as, say, a Luka at the point guard position or an SGA at the point guard position. And we'll see it a lot with the small forwards as well in the next segment, but potentially outside of, the big positions in the power forwards and centers, the shooting guard position has the most variance I saw out of all the points per game averages. But Donovan Mitchell is one of the steadiest hands in the NBA at the shooting guard position. He is someone who doesn't buy into all the noise. He truly buys into being one of the vocal leaders of this Cleveland Cavaliers team as they sit at number 1 in the Eastern Conference. And it's really down to buying into what they can do well at. Their inside-outside game can be impeccable. They can rely on the youth of Darius Garland as well at this position. But ultimately, it comes down to Donovan Mitchell's experience and his poise in this environment where you find yourself sitting atop the Eastern Conference and a lot of noise is surrounding you from the outside. And Donovan Mitchell has really controlled this team and really shown he can be the leader of a franchise looking to get back to its best from like the mid-2010s and really challenge for that Eastern Conference title and maybe even an NBA championship yet again. So kudos to Donovan Mitchell for really expanding his game, buying into the culture and identity of this Cleveland Cavaliers team, and truly being a vocal leader. But on the other hand, you get guys like Devin Booker, who really are interesting case study, because the Phoenix Suns, when they're all together, are a team that combine the most talent on a court in the NBA this season. But because of injuries, whether it be to Durant, whether it be to Booker himself, whether it be to Bradley Beal, who just came back from injury, scored 25 off the bench, I feel like this Phoenix Suns team has not yet reached its peak. And until then, I feel like players like the Bookers and Beals and Durants of the world have to carry them when they're there and when they're available, most importantly. And Devin Booker has been one of the better aspects of this team as well. He has been someone who has been a lifelong Phoenix Sun, has seen a lot of success, a lot of failure within this organization, but still has remained a steady presence in the NBA. He kind of goes a little bit underrated at certain times, but still an elite athlete in his own right. 24.7, 6.5, 3.7 stat line, 42.3 fantasy points per game average. And I do feel like as time goes on, this Suns team will begin to coalesce. Maybe a little bit too late to get into the upper reaches of the Western Conference standings, but still in the play-in tournament race. But I do feel that once this team gets healthy, it's going to be interesting to see how all of these players coalesce, how they fit into certain positions, how they work together, because I'm really interested especially in who's going to be the prime ball handler as well. Is it going to be Kevin Durant? Is it going to be someone like Bradley Beal, who hasn't necessarily been a prime facilitator that much for Phoenix in his tenure here? Will it be ultimately Devin Booker, who I feel like is the best in terms of facilitation in this team? So it's really going to come down to the health of the Phoenix Suns and what role Devin Booker will play when there's a fully healthy roster there. So that's why I feel like he's someone who's a little bit more mysterious, but still adds a lot of value as someone who might more often than not score a lot of fantasy points for you. Then let's talk about another player in the Eastern Conference realm who ultimately is the definition of team player at this current moment in time, the ultimate prototype of a shooting guard who plays unselfishly. Jaylen Brown, one of my favorite players in the entire NBA, just because of his ability to really mold into a team culture. One of the leaders of this Boston Celtics team as they go for their second straight NBA championship. And I really feel like at this current moment in time, he might just be the best shooting guard in the NBA. I know it's a little bit crazy, but he brings that versatility to the plate, both offensively and defensively, that power, that aggression offensively, and then being able to guard multiple positions on the defensive end. Really been playing selfless basketball at this point in his career. 24.6, 4.6, and 6 is a stat line, 42 fantasy points per game. Undoubtedly someone who, like I said, can be their prime ball scorer this season. He's had moments where he's had crazy numbers, like 40-point outburst on any given night, and he's perfectly capable of it. But I feel like when Jaylen Brown is at his best is when he's being selfless, dishing out assists, really willing to sacrifice his best aspects for the overall outlook of this team. And that's why they're such a difficult team to beat, and that's why they're going to be a tough out in the Eastern Conference. Yes, they're getting a lot of teams' best shots, and ultimately sometimes they've fallen short in these games. But having a guy like Jaylen Brown at the shooting guard position, being so willing to cede a lot of ball handling duties, cede a lot of responsibilities in order to really help the greater good of this basketball team is really admirable, and not a lot of players do that. And that's something I'm talking about with this position that you don't necessarily see with a lot of other positions. The shooting guard position is such a conundrum because you have these teams in the Eastern Conference, like the Cavs, like the Celtics, like some of these other teams, the Hawks maybe, say Miami, who rely a lot on team basketball. And I feel like Jaylen Brown is prototypical and representative of what these teams can achieve. But there are also teams that are forced to rely a lot more on their shooting guards, like the Phoenix Suns, and like what Devin Booker has on his plate at this current moment in time in the Western Conference. And so it's that ultimate decision that you have to make in order to decide, do you want balance in your roster that really balances out your front court, or do you really want a guy of the Devin Booker realm and this next guy we'll be talking about who can really score a lot of points because of their team situation? It's really a nice analysis to look at here, because I really respect the shooting guard position in basketball. They don't get as many plaudits as other positions, but ultimately it is a position that has to be really examined very closely if you want to get it right, because it is very difficult to describe which ways you can go and which paths you can take. But ultimately, let's talk about this last guy who falls into the latter camp here of the Western Conference teams who are kind of having to lean on their shooting guards in these desperate situations. But James Harden has been admirable this season. 45.1 fantasy points per game, 20.9, 6.1, 7.8 stat line. And I feel like James Harden is someone who has gotten a lot of flack in recent years, but really has stepped up to the plate in terms of offering this LA Clippers team, who no one thought was going to be competitive this year, a different look. And I feel like because of the absence of Kawhi Leonard for this long stretch of the season, I feel like James Harden has gone a little bit under the radar of a lot of people, underappreciated in terms of how this Clippers team looks, because this Clippers team really has kind of developed this team ethos, and I feel like that's been the best part of their growth and maturity in this trying season for them, and the reason why they sit firmly in the play-in picture. But ultimately, James Harden has to have been someone who a lot of people were saying, oh, we can't lead this team if Kawhi's out for this period of time. But he has. And it's not necessarily the prettiest numbers. You'll see 21.9, 6.1, 7.8 stat line, like I said. But it is a stat line that's indicative of James Harden buying into this Clippers team and not giving up on it. And I feel like if this team does reach the play-in, it's down to James Harden doing something that we haven't really seen from him, stepping up and maintaining that number one option in the chaotic situation like in LA, the point where they're a competitive basketball team. And once Kawhi Leonard comes back, I think he'll be a very nice compliment, and we're going to talk about Kawhi in our next segment. So I feel like the Clippers team is one of those interesting teams to monitor from a fantasy perspective, especially with the shooting guard and small forward position, which we're going to talk about, because they feel like they're in a dire situation because of the play of these unsung heroes for them. They're in a good position this season. And so that's why I feel like once Kawhi Leonard comes back, look for James Harden to continue this level of productivity. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, because it is an interesting position group to look at. But when we come back from the break, we're going to be talking about the small forward position, kind of getting into the more important guys amongst your fantasy basketball squad. So let me know what you think about the shooting guard position. When we come back, we'll be talking small forwards after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day, we'll be getting into the nitty gritty of your fantasy basketball squad. The small forward position, one of the most versatile positions in all of fantasy basketball because of the depth of that position and the ways you can frame certain players as well. For example, you want to know how we say Luke is a point guard? You could very well put him at the small forward position if you so choose. And I feel like this indefinable nature of the position makes it a lot of fun to analyze, just because all of these guys are prototypical, like I said, small forwards. But their own versatility and how they operate for their team speaks volumes to the evolution of this position and what this position really means in both real life on the basketball court and in a fantasy basketball perspective. So without further ado, let's try and tackle the complexities of the small forward position, because it is one of my favorite positions to talk about. And all four of these guys, like I said, are on rebuilding squads in a sense. They're all in and around the play-in picture, but all in squads who I feel like need to understand the evolutionary nature of the game and really appreciate these players for what they are, because they are in their own right very complex players to pin down. Because look at the importance they mean to these teams, because like I said, they are quote-unquote playing/rebuilding teams. They really are asked a lot in terms of what they mean this team, and sometimes at least the detriment of these teams, and sometimes it leads to success. And so that's what I want to say about this position, because a lot of weight are being placed on these players' shoulders, and so it's going to come down to how that affects their overall play in the landscape of the latter stage of the season as they're fighting for playoff positioning. But ultimately, I really like this position group just because of its depth as well and how much you can play around with it in terms of who to put where. Without further ado, let's talk about it. Starting off with Anthony Edwards, a guy who really had to step up this season, what with, the absence of Karl Anthony Towns off to New York and the addition of Julius Randle, because I don't necessarily think that was a partnership that a lot of people thought would work, because they are very ball-dominant guys. Julius Randle's shooting numbers have never been truly great in certain situations, and Anthony Edwards wants to be that number one option, and he has played very well. But this is a Timberwolves team, right, that got to the Western Conference Championships last year on the backs of Anthony Richardson carrying the burden. And this season it feels like, with the absence of Cat and the addition of Julius Randle, and the fact that I don't necessarily believe these sixth man options or these role players on the bench are performing at the levels they were in the postseason, I think that leads to the decline of this roster, even though I like the pieces they have. I like the depth defensively with Rudy Gobert, with the addition of someone like Julius Randle, who I still think has value there. But it's guys like Naz Reid, McDaniels, who I want to see step up and take some of the pressure off Anthony Edwards, who still has been a very impressive fantasy basketball player, 42.5 points per game in that respect, 24.8, 5.7, 3.9 stat line. But I just want to see this Wolves team alleviate the pressure on him, even though he knows he's capable of leading this team to high heights. And that's why I feel like this season has kind of been a disappointment. At least the start of the season for Minnesota has been kind of a disappointment compared to where they finished last year. But with all these players really stepping up and taking on certain roles needed for this team to succeed, like the Naz Reids and Jaden McDaniels of the world. And so, even with the additions of guys like Randall and DiVincenzo, who really, I thought, weren't necessarily great fits, but hypothetically could have balanced this team out, I'm really disappointed to see the decline of this team as a whole, and not just because of where they were last season, but because of what it means for Anthony Edwards and the challenges he might face in the latter stage of the season as he tries to make this team a viable contender again in the Western Conference. So that's kind of in the back of my mind when I think about Anthony Richardson from a fantasy perspective, as someone who to this point has been an admirable player at the small forward position, but might face a lot more pressure down the line than you might think as a fantasy player and in real life as well. Let's talk about a guy who has been absent for very long this season, missed the first 34 games of the season, finally going to come back hopefully in these next couple of weeks, Kawhi Leonard. And we talked about what he could mean as he comes back to this really revitalized LA Clippers team from where they were in the offseason when Kawhi was really disgruntled with a whole contract situation, what with everyone leaving LA, and what with just being him and Harden. And ultimately, a lot of people were spreading rumors that potentially this injury was fake, but now he's coming back to a situation that both him and Harden can work with as the leaders of this team. And we know already what value Kawhi adds in terms of his offensive prowess and the way he can space the floor, and his defensive prowess is perhaps one of the best defensive talents of his generation. So combine that with the way the Clippers are already playing in terms of what Harden has been able to do, what players like Zubac has been able to do defensively, and in terms of adding to the competitiveness of this team, I feel like Kawhi Leonard will be glad to see and enter this situation, because from where it was last year, like I said, in the offseason, I feel like there's been a narrative shift, a mindset shift, an energy shift that the Clippers can achieve something this season. And so that's why I feel like even though Kawhi Leonard has not played all this season and a lot of people are starting to lose faith in him, lose trust in him from a fantasy perspective, he still might be a high value pick in terms of when he comes back. A lot of people should be clamoring to have him in their rosters as a guy who has one of the best two-way mindsets in all of basketball. Playing for a team now that has meaning, has life, has rejuvenation to it. And I feel like Kawhi Leonard wants to play this organization at a competitive level again because he knows and sees what this team can be after all the rumblings of the offseason. So that's why, even though Kawhi has not played at all this season, he comes back into a situation that really sets up very nicely for him down the stretch. And so I'm really excited to see what he can piece together in the latter stages of the season once he returns. Now let's talk about someone really intriguing right now. And I would not have thought this player would be so controversial, so contentious at this point in his career, both a fantasy and real life perspective. Let's talk about LeBron James and what he means right now to this Lakers offense, to the organization, and to fantasy owners everywhere. Because he truly is someone who provides a lot of upside at this late stage in his career. But when we look at it, it's the detriment of this team overall. This team could be a lot better, not just a playing team, but a true Western Conference contender if LeBron's usage rate was limited. I feel like Redick hasn't understood that dynamic just yet, hasn't made the business decisions yet, where you have to weigh the options you have in this team. You have to weigh the beneficial aspects of certain decisions over the player that LeBron is. And even though he's putting up insane numbers still at this age, 50.1 fantasy points per game, 23.4, 7.7, 8.9 averages, he is someone who is just so contentious because even when he's on the court, you see that this team really is forcing things. Maybe because it's who he is, and maybe it's because of who the coach is and how he wants to approach this team. But I do feel like that connection gets in the way of what this Lakers organization is becoming. It's becoming a team that can be built around a lot of exciting youth. I love what Connect is doing. I love what Reeves can be. And I love how aggressive they've been in free agency and the draft in terms of building this team. But it can't just be around LeBron right now, because LeBron is in the future of this organization. And so that's why I'm a little bit concerned, not just in real life, but in fantasy, with how it looks in the latter stage of the season. Because I do expect the Lakers to be competitive, and they can very well steal one of those play-in spots. And I still have faith that if they do, they'll be a sneaky candidate for dark horse contender status come the postseason. But I feel like LeBron can't get in the way of that sometimes. So unfortunately, this could be a statement where I'm saying to sell LeBron at a certain point this season. But for now, I just want to see the dynamic. Because what I'm seeing is that the team surrounding him is kind of forcing things when he's on the court. And that could be because of his stature. That could be because of what JJ Redick wants out of him. But until then, I feel like LeBron James might be a detriment both in real life and fantasy. But speaking of, not necessarily detriments, but his team is not necessarily one of the best teams in the West. Let's be real here. But Lauri Markkanen has always been a special player in my mind, no matter where he's moved around. He's just been one of the most versatile athletes in the NBA, who not a lot of people really respect. And I feel like, yes, he's in a situation where it's not beneficial to anyone in the Utah Jazz organization, and I think a lot of people are disheartened by the fact this rebuild is taking a lot longer over there. But Lauri Markkanen, let's be real here, for what this team is still a very nice player, both offensively and defensively. 19.6, 6.3, 1.9. Yes, lower averages than a lot of these guys, only 33 points in fantasy per game he's given you, but still a lot of value for someone on a rebuilding team. We can't necessarily forget about Lauri Markkanen just because of the fact he's on the Utah Jazz. And I feel like, whether or not he's going to be there for the long run to help this rebuild, he is someone who I have high respect for as someone who's moved around the league a lot and still maintained that level of competitiveness and athleticism at the small forward position, and the versatility, most importantly, to help certain teams. Let me know what you think of the small forward position, because coming up next to conclude the show, our last show here with the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, is the power forward position, one of my favorite positions to talk about because of the depth and talent you can get out of it. I'll be right back to conclude the show after this short break. Welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and for our final segment of the day and of my GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast era here at the GSMC Sports Network. We're going to be talking with the top power forwards in fantasy basketball this season. A very special position in my mind, just because out of all the positions where you can mix and match certain players, this one is the most versatile in my opinion. We have guys who, for all intents and purposes, can be seen as your prototypical centers / big men, what have you, but ultimately, because of their versatility on and off the court, I feel like they are players who I highly regard as the most versatile in all of fantasy sports because of the ways it can contribute to your team. If you need rebounding, if you need defense, these are your ultimate providers, and they can come from anywhere. You don't necessarily have to define the power forward position as a quote-unquote power forward position because it's indefinable. And that's what I love about fantasy basketball. Even though I haven't played it in so long, it's just such a versatile sport that keeps you on your toes. And ultimately, the power forward position is one of the most exciting to talk about. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with a guy who I really like. Yes, he plays for the Raptors. One of my friends from Fordham Radio, shout out Trey, one of his favorite players to watch, Scotty Barnes. I feel like Scotty Barnes just does not get the appreciation he deserves for his versatility as a two-way athlete for Toronto. Yes, is Toronto a bad team at the moment? They are. But Scotty Barnes is the promise, the rejuvenation that they need. And yes, the trade with the Knicks really did not go in their favor, but by retaining a guy in Scotty Barnes who you have faith in, you drafted, you developed, it just goes to show they're willing to stick with this process. They're willing to allow Scotty Barnes to become the face of the franchise. 19.8, 6.4, 8.1 stat line for him shows that, yes, this is a rebuilding team. Because if Scotty Barnes' numbers were inflated, we would think he was on a contending team. And it just goes to show that in the NBA, it's kind of hard to develop a rebuilding roster, and it's kind of hard to do it in so many different ways. Whether it be through trades like the Raptors tried to do, and at the start it looked like they got two guys in Barron and Quickly who can contribute and alleviate the burden on Barnes, but now it's not looking that good. But ultimately, Scotty Barnes is still someone who I would invest a lot of time into if I'm Toronto. And if I'm a fantasy basketball owner, we're really looking forward to seeing how he grows once the Raptors get better as well, should he remain with this franchise for the long run. Because if he does, it's going to be a nice investment for Toronto. And I really feel his talent lies in his abilities to be that versatile player who can play and guard multiple different positions. So that's why I feel like Scotty Barnes adds a lot of value from a fantasy perspective. Maybe not as a starter level player, potentially as a role player, a flex player off your bench. So that's what I see in Scotty Barnes. Someone who right now, because of his team circumstances, isn't as desirable as some of the guys we'll be talking about later, but ultimately still adds a lot of value in what he can become with the future of this franchise. So that's why I'm really looking forward to the development of Scotty Barnes in Toronto. Now let's talk about Karl Anthony Towns, because a lot of people think of this guy as your prototypical center, prototypical big man. But in the landscape of the New York Knicks, and knowing this because my father is a New York Knicks fan, you really don't have a position as a New York Knick. All you are basically is someone who's asked to put up a lot of points. And if you do that on a consistent basis, Tom Thibodeau really doesn't care what position you play. He's just going to put you out there on a consistent basis and ask you to do the best you can in offense. And because it's Cat, it's someone who adds a lot of value to this Knicks team that was very stagnant because of that mindset from Tibbs last year. Because a lot of pressure was on Jalen Brunson, and even though Jalen Brunson is otherworldly at the point guard position, you kind of needed that stability and spacing in your front court with Cat, and he's provided that in spades. I really like the tempo now from what I've seen of this Knicks offense and what Cat brings, both in versatility on the offensive side of the basketball and on the defensive side. And so that's what value Cat brings even in this very interesting Knicks system. Because when I look at what the Knicks can be in the Eastern Conference for not just this year but for years to come, they can be a team that, yes, while they rely too heavily on their stars, it's because of their stars that they can really challenge teams, because you're seeing the same faces minute after minute on the court with you. And that can really sink into opposing teams' heads and really get them thinking about, okay, if these guys can keep up with us for this long, then we got to ramp up our game. And I don't necessarily think that in certain moments, teams can really match the Knicks' energy when they're on. It's that tempo that they bring, that energy that they bring when all of their starters are on the court for an extended period of time that allows them to do this under Tibbs. And if it were any other head coach, I would think they were crazy, but Tibbs clearly has the structure set in place where he trusts his core, and his core is paying, as Taptler says, you calling Tibbs a rambling man? Or I am calling Tibbs kind of a rambling man, because he is someone who, there's a method to his madness, but sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't. But ultimately, it's in this Eastern Conference that preaches team basketball. Very interesting to see, and a nice contrast to what other teams are doing around them. And Cat is a big part of that. It's an investment they made, saying that, yes, we understand we need the spacing and stability in our offense, but we also are going to continue to incorporate him into Tibbs' system. So that's what I love about Cat, both in real life and as a fantasy player, because you know he's going to put up the big numbers. You know he's going to have the minutes required to put up those big numbers game in, game out. So that's why I really like Tibbs and Cat's combo here, because of the value he brings in terms of what he does offensively for this team. Then at 2, Giannis. It's been kind of a weird season for Giannis, yes, and the Bucks overall. They started off pretty rocky. Now they've gotten into form. Giannis playing at his usual level, 32.6, 6.1, 11.6 rebounds. And I feel like, Giannis is still that guy who a lot of people buy into in terms of his abilities on the offensive side of the basketball. And I feel like the Bucks are starting to become more of a team-oriented organization, where they're starting to invest in what they've built through the draft, through trade acquisitions, even though they feel like they're over the hill as a team. And I mean by that is they are an older roster, but they still feel like they can get the most out of this team, even though I don't necessarily view them as one of the top contenders in the Eastern Conference. They're going to have to get through the Celtics, the Cavs of the world, the Knicks of the world. And I'm not necessarily certain this team is well equipped enough outside of the rapport that has been built up between Giannis and Lillard these past couple of games, to where I'm confident that they can make some noise in the East this year. And I have a lot of respect for the Bucks, because they're at this point where they have the championship with Giannis. They have gone to the playoffs consistently, and they were the prototype that everyone was looking up to in the Eastern Conference once, all these younger teams started to create their own revolution. But the reason why Giannis and Lillard don't appeal to me more in real life than they do in fantasy is because of the lack of youth and depth in youth in this team, respectively. That gives me pause about their future. I still think that if should Giannis decide to see his supermax out and stay with the Bucks for the long run, I feel like they're starting to build something to the point where they're one of the most dynamic duos in the league and one of the most clutch duos in the league as well. But I'm not necessarily certain that in the Eastern Conference, at the very least, they are that competitive. But still, from a fantasy perspective, Giannis is as good as you can get at any position, really. So I really think that from a fantasy standpoint, you should buy him for the next couple of years for as long as he's playing at this high level, but not necessarily the Bucks as a whole. It's going to come down to that partnership between those two players, him and Lillard, and how those pieces that you develop for years if you're the Bucks organization coalesce around them. If not, then I can't really buy into this Bucks team anymore. But I still believe in the dynamic tandem that these two can be. But then let's talk about the number one player, one of the most versatile players from a fantasy basketball perspective, Jason Tatum. Could very well have been in the small forward segment. Could very well have been anywhere on this list, really. It's because of his versatility for the Celtics, his ability to guard so many different positions, his ability to be selfless like Jaylen Brown, that makes Tatum such a special but still very contentious fantasy basketball player, because a lot of people, A, either don't necessarily appreciate the balance he brings that much, or B, they just don't necessarily like the Celtics as a fantasy basketball team to invest in. And you'll be right in so doing, because they are a balanced team where no one player dominates the fantasy stat sheets. But I've loved Tatum just because he is someone who buys into this team culture, but still plays like someone who knows he's a superstar. And when you have a player like that on a team like the Celtics, it pays dividends because he really elevates the team. Yes, there's talks that amongst the Celtics fan base, he needs his usage rate to really ramp up, because I feel like in clutch moments, Jason Tatum kind of goes missing, and it could be down to Joe Mazzulla's management. But ultimately, I do feel that when Jason Tatum is on the court, and when he's playing not just with his starting five, but with these depth pieces, he adds so much value because he's willing to buy into the fact that it's not just one player. It's the depth of this roster. It's 11, 12 players that can come together and really be something special. And that's why I feel like Jason Tatum might just be my favorite fantasy basketball player to talk about. Let me know what you think in the comments, because that will just about do it for the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast completely. Hopefully they'll be getting a new host soon, but thus far I'm not too certain about that, and we will be transitioning to the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. We're really excited for that transition, but ultimately, thank you guys for tuning in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. For the long run, it has been an honor and a pleasure to be your host for these past couple of months. But I'm moving on to pastures new. Come back here tomorrow, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, for the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. I'm out until then. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for the ride.